Okay, now we're going to switch gears a little bit and talk about material cycles. So these are important things that occur in ecosystems and between ecosystems. So the first one we're going to talk about is the hydrologic cycle, or basically the water cycle might be what you've heard before. That's basically the path of water through the environment. So we know that the sun gets really hot. It has been lately. And that causes water to evaporate that's been stored in oceans and on land and distributes water vapor around the planet. So I mean, it finally started raining a little bit, but in August, it was starting to get really dry because we had evaporated a lot of the water that was on the surface around here. So that water that's in the air condenses over land surfaces and then rains or precipitates down as rain or snow or hail or sleet or all those different forms of precipitation that we know about. And that water is really important for all these terrestrial systems. Water is important for cellular metabolism, for nutrient flow in ecosystems, and the global distribution of heat and energy. So this is a diagram of the hydrologic cycle. So it's showing solar energy causing evaporation from the ocean, causing evaporation from soil, streams, rivers, and lakes. And also we get transpiration from vegetation. So as plants are doing photosynthesis, they're releasing water into the air. We see that condenses into clouds and causes precipitation over the ocean and over land. And the movement of moist air from the ocean to the land also occurs. After that precipitation occurs, it goes into surface water and also percolates into the ground to become groundwater. And groundwater also flows and can connect to surface water as the ocean or as lakes and streams. There is also the carbon cycle, which begins with the intake of carbon dioxide during photosynthesis, where the carbon atoms in the carbon dioxide are incorporated into the sugar, like we talked about, to make glucose, which is eventually released by cellular respiration. So when I eat an apple and my body breaks it down and I use the sugars for energy, I then breathe carbon dioxide out that has the carbon from the apple in it. Sometimes carbon is not recycled for a very long time. So if carbon gets buried and lots of pressure is on it, it can become coal or oil, but that takes millions of years. And when we burn those fossil fuels, the carbon is released back into the air. We also see that some carbon is locked in calcium carbonate, so it's a mineral that we use. So basically limestone and fossil shell deposits are calcium carbonate, and some organisms use calcium carbonate, this limestone, to make their own shells, like snails and oysters and things like that. So the parts of the carbon cycle where carbon dioxide is removed from the atmosphere, like into plants, is called a carbon sink. And the parts of the cycle that release carbon dioxide are called carbon sources. So when we eat and we breathe out carbon dioxide, we're a carbon source. Burning of fossil fuels generates large amounts of carbon dioxide that cannot be taken up fast enough by carbon sinks. This excess carbon dioxide contributes to global warming or to climate change. So this diagram shows the carbon cycle. We see plants taking up carbon dioxide to do photosynthesis. Plants and other organisms all do respiration, which release carbon dioxide back into the atmosphere. We see that some carbon dioxide gets dissolved into water, particularly the ocean, and there's a lot of that, and some of it gets released back through to biological and chemical processes. Land clearing, so clearing plants does result in the release of carbon dioxide, and burning fossil fuels also causes the release of carbon dioxide and methane, which is another form of carbon. We also see that sedimentation, so when particles in the ocean that contain carbon settle down, they create sediments at the bottom of the ocean. This also happens at the bottoms of lakes. So we see this balance. It looks like this is a small amount, but it's changing the balance between the amount of carbon sinks and carbon sources. Okay, next up is the nitrogen cycle. Nitrogen is needed to make proteins and nucleic acids like DNA. So we have to eat food with protein because we need to have proteins, and that's why we get nitrogen and why we eat nitrogen. Plants take up nitrogen. They need it too to be able to do their cellular processes, and they take it up from the environment to build proteins, which consumers later eat. Nitrogen gas is abundant in the atmosphere, but it's very hard to use because it has a triple bond, which is very hard to break. So it takes a lot of energy to break the triple bond in nitrogen gas. But there are some organisms that can do it through a process called nitrogen fixation. So the fungi and bacteria change nitrogen gas into a useful form by combining it with hydrogen to make ammonia and ammonium. And this takes a lot of energy. Other bacteria can convert ammonia into nitrites and nitrates, which can be taken up by plants to make proteins. So this is an example of a bean plant that has root nodules, these things here. And so members of the bean family, these legumes, have these nitrogen fixing bacteria that live in these nodules. And it helps them get nitrogen and make it more accessible to the plant. So that's why if you've ever heard about rotating soybeans and corn, the soybeans have these root nodules with the bacteria that fix nitrogen, and so that enriches the soil with more nitrogen. And then corn uses the nitrogen. They don't have this relationship. And so that's why rotating crops can be very helpful and mean that you spend less on fertilizer. So nitrogen re-enters the environment when organisms die and are broken down, and also through excrement and urinary wastes. Nitrogen re-enters the atmosphere when denitrifying bacteria break down nitrogen back into nitrogen gas and nitrous oxides. People have actually changed the nitrogen cycle dramatically. We figured out how to do industrial fixation. Industrial nitrogen fixation. So those organisms do it naturally and have for a long time. People have done it by burning a lot of fossil fuels. They can break that triple bond in the nitrogen gas to make fertilizers that they can sell and then spread on different fields. We also alter the nitrogen cycle by planting lots of nitrogen fixing crops. So we plant tons of soybeans all over the United States, which creates many more nitrogen fixers than would normally occur. Also, fossil fuels often have nitrogen in them, and they get released into the atmosphere as nitrous oxides when they are burned. So this shows the nitrogen cycle. There's nitrogen in the atmosphere, and so lightning and volcanoes also fix nitrogen, and then we have some nitrogen fixation. We have these that are incorporated into different organisms. We have nitrification that changes the form of nitrogen. It gets assimilated into plants. And then we have denitrifying bacteria that produce nitrogen gas that goes back into the atmosphere. The nitrogen cycle is pretty complicated, so I don't necessarily expect you to remember what nitrification and denitrification are and all these different steps, but I do want you to know what nitrogen fixation is, and I want you to know the basic idea that there is nitrogen in the atmosphere and it gets fixed, and then it moves through these different parts, and it can also go back up into the atmosphere through some bacteria and by burning fossil fuels. Okay, Next up is the phosphorus cycle. We need phosphorus in our DNA, in ATP, it's the P part of ATP. And that's basically the, excuse me, the energy currency of the cell. So when we're breaking down glucose, we make ATP, and that's how we get our energy. And so we have to have ATP, so we have to have phosphorus, but it's also important in some other biomolecules as well. Phosphorus compounds are leached from rocks and minerals and usually transported in water, so that's what aqueous forms means. I do want to note phosphorus does not have a gas phase. So carbon had carbon dioxide, water had water vapor in the atmosphere, nitrogen had nitrogen gas. Phosphorus is not in the atmosphere. There's not a gas form of phosphorus. So it basically comes from rocks and then gets transported around and taken up by organism. And then when the organisms decompose, it's returned to the environment. The cycle takes a really long time because deep ocean sediments can be major sinks for phosphorus. So there's a lot of phosphorus stored at the bottom of the ocean. This shows the phosphorus cycle. You can see again, there's no gas phase, so it's not in the air. It weathers from rocks and mining of phosphate rocks. It's taken up by plants. It's also mined to be fertilizer. It runs off into the ocean and can also soak into the, the groundwater. And sometimes when there's geologic uplift, new phosphorus deposits are exposed that can be weathered and enter the cycle again. All right, that is the end of energy and matter and life. And this, I know, was a lot of you. It was a lot of basic biology, a lot of basic chemistry, some, basic chemical cycles and things like that. So again, if you're having any trouble with this material, please read through your book and please come ask me any questions that you have. Thanks a lot.